Welcome into the Where You're Going podcast. I'm your host and hopefully your friend as well, John Little. Thank you so much for being here. And you've heard me say it before. Say it with me. Now, we believe at the Where You're Going podcast, it is not about where you've been. It's not even about where you are right now. It is about where you're going and who you are becoming. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. Thank you so much to everybody that's subscribing to the show, whether it be on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe and also activate that little bell so you get an email every single time we put out a show. You can also subscribe and get an email whenever we put out a show as well on our website, whereyourgoingpod.com, whereyourgoingpod.com. And you can do the very same thing wherever you get your podcasts as well, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the whole deal. And we've gotten some great feedback on the show. Thank you so much to everybody that's reviewed the show. I want to read one of those to you. This one's from Brianna. Such an inspiring podcast. John does a great job of sounding like that best friend who is giving great life advice. Love how he stresses hope and a bright future for all of us. Thank you so much, Brianna. It is an honor to bring those to you. So please keep the reviews coming. Not for me, I promise, but just so other people find the show. Rate and review it today. And make sure you're tuned in every single week. This week, we're going to get real. And I do want to, right off the bat, before we get into the interview, give you a trigger warning for some child sexual abuse. And we do not get graphic or very specific in this, but there are a couple references that happened to our guest. So if that's a trigger for you, we totally understand. But I do want to let you know it's as respectful as you can be, and there are no graphic details in this. But this is an important story. It's a story of trauma. It's a story of addiction as an adult, and it's a story of healing. And you can only imagine how that hits my heart. It's my pleasure to bring on my new friend, Dr. Mark McNear. A licensed psychotherapist, 30 years of experience, and now he is changing even more lives through his memoir, Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. Thank you so much for the time, Dr. McNear. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, John. I appreciate being on.
I think it's just a remarkable story, and we will certainly get into it. But one of the first things that strikes me is you're a psychotherapist. You are helping people heal along the way, while at the same time, I don't want to spoil it for everybody, but you start with it right off the bat in your book. Mm-hmm. Your life is falling apart in your early 50s to the point that through your addiction, you can't even work anymore. What was that like, trying to help people at the same time, feeling like you couldn't help yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I talk about this some in the book, but I got to the point where I really couldn't function anymore, and I was sleeping half the day, and the rest of the day that I was watching TV and just kind of zoning out. You know, I had done fairly well before then, but I think that what had happened, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, that idea that my dad had passed away in July of 2014, and then by March of 2015, I was in really bad shape, and the addictions had really caught up with me. And so by then I just wasn't functioning. And so by then I really wasn't seeing patients.
Mm. And so for, so many years of your adult life, 35 years of your adult life, something like that, you say, you're running away from your past, right? And you're trying to outrun this addiction and this abuse that has happened and this trauma. And you're even trying to run away from God in that sense. And eventually it all catches up. And, I can certainly relate. I know there are a lot of people that can relate to that as well. We can outrun those things and, kind of put them on the back burner only for so long before they really start deeply impacting our lives. How do you try to help people see that, admit to it before it's so debilitating?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, John, it's hard for people to see it, because they're so used to it. That's their norm. And
Mm,
so, I think that, you know, I talk in the book about my life getting smaller and smaller. Addictions cause my life to get smaller and smaller. And so I try to work with people and try to get them to explore what they would want in their lives if they didn't struggle with the addictions that they are struggling with. And so, I think that I go about it and looking at, how their life could be better without the addictions. But it's hard because denial comes in, and I talk in the book about, the addict is the last one to realize they have a problem.
absolutely. And it is so true. And until things hit the fan, and for you, it was not being able to provide for your family and the mood swings, as you mentioned, sleeping half the day, not being able to work until you absolutely hit rock bottom. You couldn't admit it. And even then, you went into rehab thinking that this rehab situation where you were addicted to prescription medication and obviously you had other issues, the depression, everything kind of
Mm-hmm.
compiling. But you went into that thinking, all right, it's a process, it's 4 weeks, I'm in, I do my time, I'm out, I'm back to work. But how long did it take for you to realize it was so much more than that and the work to be done was so much deeper?
I think it took me about 4 weeks in rehab to realize, and I talk about in the book how memories of the trauma came back to me. And so, the addiction, and I talk about this in the book, the addiction was a problem, but the addiction was not the problem. The problem was the trauma that I was running away from, all of the pain from my childhood that I was running away from. So it was about 4 weeks into rehab, feelings, feeling just like lost and feeling empty, but yet also the medication was going out of my system. And as the medication went out of my system, the memories from my childhood, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the verbal abuse, the emotional abuse all came back really vividly. And that was one of the things that the medication did for me is it kept that away from me, so to speak.
And I've gotten into, I mean, kind of briefly, my addiction history over the course of this show.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, um, I don't want to make it about me at all, but it's just my experience that I echo exactly what you said, that is the trauma, it is our past, that and really our ability to cope, inability I should say, to cope with the past, the things that have happened to us, that come out in these addictions. But I will say this: when my addiction first reared its ugly head very early in my marriage, this was like back in 2006 or something like that, and I don't know if I just wasn't going to the right person or what. It was more about, okay, go to Celebrate Recovery and figure out how to stop doing this thing instead of really getting to the root of the trauma. But 3 years ago, when I really started to work on the trauma, that is when the real, like, lasting change I feel like occurred. How long have we, and you as a psychotherapist, known truly that trauma is the root to basically all addiction?
I think that in the 1990s, a lot of the studies started going in that direction. And I think about Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate. He talks about, don't ask why the addiction, ask what the pain is. And so there's been a lot of studies now with trauma, and that has really helped. The research has shown that people who struggle with addictions, whether it be substance addictions or process addictions, either way, that they have a history of trauma, and that the addictions serve as a way for them to self-soothe the pain that it doesn't work. but it's what people use to self-soothe the pain from the trauma.
And as I even have friends at this point in my life that are dealing with, different addictions, um, I'm no psychotherapist, but I'm like, all right, what else is going on here, bud? You got to get to the root of it, or it's never going to. It's like digging up a root, right? You got to get to the bottom of it. And I think one of the things that really just struck me is just how much shame was involved in personally the inability to think back. You even promised God, hey, I'm never going to look at
Mm-hmm.
what happened in my past,
Right,
because
right.
you know you felt, you shouldn't have, obviously, but you felt this personal shame where you felt like you couldn't even bring it up. How
Yeah,
do you help people with that are experiencing that shame?
yeah. I think that for me, I can tell you, first of all, what happened with me is that I was able to get around a lot of really safe people, and I talk about that in the book. And those safe people, were able to move toward my story, not move away from, but move toward my story, and allow me to share it as I was ready to share it. And so I do the same thing now in working with people. There's no pressure that they have to share so much in the session. They share as they're ready to share. And it's really a process. It's not a procedure where somebody comes in and gets it done. It's a process that I have seen unfold in my own life. I talk about it, as you know, in chapters 4, 5, and 6, just the abuse that I had, and a lot of the things that I talk about there, I couldn't have talked about 5, 6 years ago. And now I'm able to talk about it with a certain amount of ease, and so it was a matter of going back to the title of the book, finding my words. It was a matter of me being able to find my words and then speak my words and then finally embrace them and to use them, as a vehicle to help others. And I'm especially passionate for people in the church to be able to hear that, because I know in my own life it has helped me so much. And so I really feel passionate that other believers can, use the same things that I had in my life, safe people, with the Lord by their side to go through and to talk about things that were just unmanageable for me to talk about alone.
This is a topic that I wanted to get into at some point during the show. I didn't know when I was going to be able to. So thank you for opening the door.
Sure.
The church and a true belief in God and a true belief that God can heal all wounds, that relationship with God, but then the necessity of, of the psychotherapy, of the sessions, of the counseling, of the community as well. How do you think that the church and therapy can work better as we continue to move through and help people with pain, with abuse, with addictions?
The good news is I think it's happening in a lot of churches. I think we have a long way to go, but I think it's happening. And I think just being trauma informed to realize that we have bodies, and we carry this pain around us in our bodies, and so I talk about it in the book, and I wanted to be really open with this. It wasn't a story of me going to rehab, me working through these stories, some of these horrific stories that I talk about in the book, and then suddenly, the last 3 chapters of the book, everything's fine. I talk about, and I want it to be real to say, as a believer in Jesus Christ, I struggle with depression. I struggle with anxiety. I struggle with a lot of internalized anger. I'm working on all of these things, but I struggle with them. I struggle with flashbacks, of the abuse that I had, especially the sexual abuse that I had. And I wanted to put it out there, to give other people permission. And I think that is one of the things that we need to do in church, is to realize that we need to give people permission to have problems. I think it was Sheila Walsh that said, it's okay not to be okay. That's why Jesus came. And so it's not like we come to know Christ and all of our problems go away. And in this process, I think, you know, as I've progressed in my healing, I see so many more problems that I have than I even realized, and it's okay. It says in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6, be confident of this very thing, that he, God, who has begun a good work in us, he will continue it until the day of Christ Jesus. He is working on us daily, to conform us to the image of his son. And, I'm real quick to say, John, I've had a lot of wounding, and I limp, and it's okay that I limp. And I'm very clear with people, whether it's people that I'm working with in psychotherapy or whether it's in the church that I'm in, that I struggle. I struggle with my emotions. I struggle with anxiety. I don't struggle as much as I did 5 years ago. I don't even struggle as much as I did 3 years ago, but I still struggle. And I think I'll struggle until the day that I see Jesus face to face. So I think that message needs to get out there.
Oh, I totally agree. And I want to honor you for taking those steps. And I'm so glad that you have the forum and then you've decided to write this book, not to say, I have it all together. And here's where I wanted to go next. You're not saying in this book, I've got it all together, and here are the 5 steps that you need to take to get it all together as well. This is a book, this is a memoir where you simply present your story. As tough as it is to read, as tough as it is to put ourselves in the body of little Mark as a kid and say,
Mm-hmm.
my goodness, this is so difficult. And as you say in the book several times, healing takes time. But you're not coming at it from somebody who feels like they've got it all together. You simply present your story and say, there's simply hope in exploring, in trying, in starting to look at your trauma.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that I talk about in the book is, an incident that happened when I was about 4 years old. My dad had forced me to eat carrots, and I'm sitting at the dinner table, and so I end up vomiting as a result of being forced to eat carrots. And my dad becomes irate and picks me up and throws me in the garbage. He says, "Stay there, you're a piece of garbage. That's where you belong." Fast forward, and this is one of the things that I talk about in the book that I want people to hear is, the past is not the past when it comes up in the present. And so fast forward, I'm 4 years old, and that happens. Fast forward to 28 years old, I'm with my wife, we're at a wedding, and I'm sitting there, and they serve steak, and they serve potatoes, and they serve carrots. And so without even thinking, John, I stab into one of the carrots, and I take a bite of it, and then I just begin to gag, and it came right back to me what happened when I was 4 years old. And so, that's so, so true with trauma. The past is not the past when it shows up in the present. And it does so much of the time.
And so many of us don't realize, and it may not be carrots, it may be something totally different. So many of us don't realize my reaction to this situation or why I isolate. I know that's something that you talked about in the book,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
that's where the only safe place, if it even was safe, was in your room. And I felt the same way growing up. I felt like I've got to get away. I've got to isolate. The reason that we do things like that today as adults is because it was a coping mechanism when we were kids, or it was a trigger response to something that happened when we were kids. And
Yeah.
I'm guessing that a lot of people just don't realize that.
Right. And I talk about in the book, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, all of these different ways to handle trauma. And another example that's not in the book that I'll give you is, my wife and I get married, and we get our first house with electric garage doors. And so Debbie goes to work, and she comes home, and I notice when the garage door goes up, my heart starts to pound, and I get really uptight, and this is as an adult. Well, looking back as a child, when my dad would get home from wherever he was, whether it was work or somewhere else, where he was out and the garage door went up, my body would stiffen, and I would begin to get really, really anxious. So that part of the brain doesn't differentiate between, today and what happened years ago. And we see that a lot with war veterans, the same thing that happens, when July 4th comes around and the fireworks are going, and they are triggered so much by the noises that they hear.
Absolutely. And you've talked about how just, the triggers can happen and also the coping mechanisms. I thought this was so interesting when I saw it in the book, is that you would you would joke in a way about the pain. Like that was a way, a deflection, if you will, to, I don't know if it was like joking about your situation in life growing up or what. Like I've joked against myself a lot, like
Mhm.
about my weight, or about, just, not it being ugly, I think, more than
Mhm.
anything. And a lot of times those jokes, those that self-deprecation, or trying to make light of something, is a compensation as well.
Yeah, I think it protects us from the real sadness that we're feeling deep down inside. And so it's a maladaptive way, but it's a way of coping with the pain that we've had in our lives. And I
Mm.
did that for years with different things. I would always poke fun at myself for different things, and I think that it was just a way to cope with how uncomfortable I felt in my own skin.
It is so interesting. Another thing I wrote down while I was reading your book last night is, you were talking a lot about, how, especially your father, and also there was a specific teacher as well in your book that had some very mean things to say about you as well, when comparing you to your sister, and how smart she was basically and how stupid you were, which is
Mhm.
not true, obviously, but that's basically
Mhm.
what she was saying.
Right.
And I thought about it. Why do I, like, personally have an inner critic? Like, we don't probably come out of the womb, Mark, thinking that we're bad in some way, or man, I'm not a very good, bottle feeder, or I'm not a very good walker. We don't come out of the womb thinking we're poor at these things. We pick it up along the way. That's why we have an inner critic.
Yeah, yeah. Whether it be parents or whether it be other adults around us, or in the case of my sixth grade teacher, saying negative things about me, we internalize those voices, and then we use them and start talking to ourselves in that way. And we walk through life like that if we don't realize it.
Mm, absolutely. We're visiting with an incredible author, Dr. Mark McNear. And just what makes him incredible is the way he has followed God's leading, even to write the book for so long. For most of your life, more than 90% of your life, you wanted all this stuff to remain hidden. If you would have been buried with those memories, that's what you would have chosen. Except, your just life got to a point where you couldn't do that.
Mhm.
How did you finally get from that to putting it all on paper?
I think that, I talk in the book about calling a psychiatrist my psychiatrist, and I asked her in March of 2015 for refills, and it became very clear to her, very apparent quickly, that I was abusing the medication, and so she was very quick to say to me, "You need to go to rehab." And so I realized at that point, that I wasn't getting any more refills, and I needed to do something. And so, that day I waited for my wife. It was a hard day. I waited for my wife Debbie to get home from school, and I explained to her that I had talked to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist had recommended that I go to rehab. And Debbie was so supportive and so grace filled, and just said, "I'm really, really glad that you're going to get help." And then after that, I contacted my daughter Emily, and she was just wonderful with it. And she had said, "I'm so proud of you." And I can remember just like choking up and being like, "Wow, they're being supportive of me." And I had no idea John, what I was in for, and that's, I think a lot of times the Lord, just brings you to a certain point, and then you deal with certain things, and then you deal with other things that come along, and other things. It's been a wonderful journey, been a hard journey, and I talk about that in the book, but it's been a really worthwhile journey. My life is so much different now. It's not perfect, as as I've alluded to. I struggle with emotional things, and struggle with flashbacks and symptoms from complex PTSD. But it was my wife talks about this all the time, that she saw, that the Lord brought me step by step by step. It wasn't all at once. And sometimes people look at it, and they're like, heal me, Lord. That's it. I want to be healed. I would have never dreamt that I could have even gotten through some of the things that I've gotten through, the pain that I've gotten through, but it really, really helped to have supportive family members, really, really helpful to have really good counselors. I mentioned one of them in the book, Harry Flanagan. He had me, I started sharing with him a little bit of the traumas that I had. And so he suggested to me to write down the traumas, or type them up on a Word document. And that was really hard to do. And that's the basis of chapters 4, 5, and 6. But he was really gentle, and he was trained in trauma and trauma informed, and so he let me go at my own pace, and allowed me to talk about some of the things in each session, but never rushed me. And so you really need people that have gone before you, and that they've been able to do this, and so also friends. I've had phenomenal friends that have walked with me, who really understand the journey, and I would share with them little by little things that I was learning about my childhood. And, they stayed in the room, they didn't leave. They stayed there and cared about me, and really showed a lot of sensitivity and empathy. And didn't, I talk about, that idea that they moved forward, they didn't move back. They didn't, kind of feel, I didn't feel like I was being rejected, even with their body language, but they were there for me. A lot of counseling. Yeah, I'm in counseling now. I'm doing a lot of internal family systems work, but just hours and hours of counseling to be able to process the trauma that I had. And, the addictions are not the problem now. It is, really, really the trauma and the symptomology still from the trauma, or the aftermath of the trauma, that I struggle with at times.
And it's totally understandable. But there is hope, and you can see movement. And what I want people to pay attention to is that it's okay that it takes time. It is okay that it takes
Absolutely.
time. And that is for the patient, and that is for the loved ones around them as well, right? We can't rush our loved one as they're going through this healing journey. This healing journey
Yeah,
is their own.
it took me 55 years to get where I was with addictions and things. And then,
Wow.
for me to expect that it would all be erased within a couple of years is ridiculous. I remember, and I talk about this in the book, that I had a really fine psychiatrist, Dr. Joe Garbley, and he had shared with me in one of our first visits how much time it was going to take, and that was a relief to me, to know that it was going to take time, and that I didn't need to rush, that I needed, God's not in a hurry in healing us. He takes his time, and he is gentle, and he is
Mm-hmm.
kind, and he's
Mm-hmm.
loving, he is graceful, and he is merciful to us. And so I'm always telling him we need to go faster. He doesn't seem to listen. He doesn't seem to listen to me with that. But, I think that, just realizing that it's really a sacred work of going through this healing process, and to just stop at different times, and just to appreciate where you are in the journey.
Absolutely. Where you're going is so much better than where you've been.
Absolutely.
And I just love that promise. I just believe that. And also want to call forward again people around those that need help, because you talk about community a bunch of times in your book, but the The quote on page 11 is, "We get hurt in relationships. The only place to get healed is in relationships as well." And that was very impactful to me
Yeah,
too, to read that.
Dr. Ted Roberts from Pure Desire Ministries wrote that, and I think that there's not a truer statement, and I think that for those in listening to this that might be struggling with addictions, or that their life is a mess right now, I would say just find just one person to take a risk, and start to tell them a little bit and see if they're safe. You know, I think that just even having one person that believes in you and has been through it. I've talked about the fact, John, that I sat in NA meetings and I never talked. I wasn't willing to talk, but I listened. And it was so helpful for me just to hear other people's stories and to hear, the hope that they climbed out of it. And so that's what I wanted to do with the book, is to say, what, here's this guy that really fell, was addicted heavily, who really like hit rock bottom, but by the grace of God, he got back up and he started going slowly, and he took his time, but that he's really, really happy that he did, because life is pretty good now, and it's nowhere near what it looked like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. My marriage has been restored. My relationship with my daughter and my son-in-law is wonderful. I have I can't tell you how many friends that I have that I can talk to about these things now. Just so important. I have a church that I really, really love. I have a pastor, Kirk Ruprecht, that is just wonderful. And so just, some days I sit and I am so grateful, just for the work that God has done in me. There's other days that I'm struggling, but, I try to build gratitude in every day. I really do, because it's really helpful with a story like mine, a messy story like mine.
Absolutely. Gratitude is absolutely huge. And so I just, if we're going to pick out, three things out of this, is it takes time. You need safe people. And then if you're on the other end of it, if you're trying to help somebody, just that ministry of presence, to be with them, to lean in, as you said, and not be scared, not back off, but to
Yeah,
lean
I think it's
into them and be with them.
Yeah, I think it's Second Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 3 through 5, I believe, that talks about, God came alongside us in our
Hmm.
struggles so that we could do that for other people. And that's really my ministry now, to come alongside other people that have struggled like I have, or have
Yeah.
had, trauma, and to be able to shake my head and to be able to give them assurance that there is hope on the other side.
Dr. Mark McNear is our guest, and his book is Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. And where can we find the book, Dr. McNear?
It is on Amazon.
Okay, fantastic. And it is well worth it. I was able to take in the book, just last night, and I'm looking forward to, getting in there as well and doing some of the answering of the questions, not just in my head this time, but actually writing it down, because it is such valuable work that we can do right alongside a guy that wants to walk with us, right?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We have been blessed by it, and continued blessings in your work and your recovery.
Thank you, John.
Wow. What an incredible story. My new friend, Dr. Mark McNear, I cannot thank him enough for coming on the show. And we packed a lot into just the last 30 minutes. Certainly something you've got to share with those you love. And again, his book, Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. And I hope I emphasize this enough. This is not a book that is over your head. This is not a book where Dr. McNear's got it all together and the rest of us are just fighting for scraps. No, he is right in the middle of it. He knows that healing takes a long time. And he heals us with his story. This is in the trenches. This is I'm there with you. And this is so valuable and helps us know, those of us that have been through trauma. And as we go on, we learn that's a lot of us, right? We're learning as we go on that we are not alone and there is healing. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show today. Cannot thank you enough. Make sure to rate and review and subscribe and be back with us next week, because it's not about where we've been. It's not about where we are right now. It's about where we're going and who we're becoming. We'll talk to you next week.